Hello and welcome to this, what will hopefully be a new series of art journaling videos that I am planning. I'm Iris and I'm going to basically show you a little bit how I journal and talk you through all the things that I do in my kind of normal process. Here I am working in my junk journal and I have taken some woodies, Stabilo woodies, and I am starting on the background, just kind of filling it. The purpose of this isn't really to create anything specific, it's more about just keeping my hand moving, warming up. Here I'm going in with some gesso, where just to kind of get a nice background, mush in the colors. I dip my brush into water to kind of like make it flow a bit better. And again, so these first layers, they're just about getting some color down, about getting rid of the blank page, or not that this is a blank page. And here I'm using the gesso again, but with a brayer to add more texture. So the texture from the brush is very different from the texture of the brayer. And I'm layering these kind of beginnings so that once I work on the rest of the page, it will just really have a nice kind of interesting base layer. It really shines through in the end, the more complex you make things. So I just put the paint straight onto the page here, and now I'm going to start adding little paint strokes. And what you'll notice is that I am not putting everything all over. So I'm trying to kind of decide, okay, there's going to be a little bit here and a little bit there. But I don't do every technique that you see me apply everywhere, because that would just make the page look really samey. So I had this post-it note that I made some notes on, and I thought I really didn't want to throw it away. I thought it was a great thing to just put in a random journal page. And you can see I'm applying it with some gel medium. I wrote on it initially with a fountain pen, and you can see it kind of smudged there, but it's a nice touch, I think. I'm coming in with some blue paint here and just kind of making shapes with a thinner brush. Again, just playing, just warming up, playing, not really thinking too much about it, experimenting, that kind of thing. Here I was inspired by the fact that there was some red paint already in the fold of the page, and I thought, okay, I'll add some more red in that same area. So it's kind of, it isn't really working towards a specific result. It's responding to what's happening on the page and kind of what you're thinking in that moment. I don't waste any excess paint. I will just like rub it off in a different part of the page, or I might turn the page onto a new one and like rub the paint off just so that it doesn't go to waste. Here I am coming in with watercolors, again just to layer up interesting layers. This is obviously, watercolors are transparent or translucent, and so if you add them as like a second layer or a third layer, and then you kind of keep coming back, it adds a real depth to the page that you wouldn't get if you're just adding like opaque layers or things like that. It's important to note that in the video editing, I've cut out all the bits where, for example, I'm drying my page. I dry my page pretty much in between every application of paint, because it really helps keep the colors bright and to not kind of like mix things together that you don't intend to, because when that happens, especially if the colors are kind of opposite on the color wheel, you will kind of make a muddy mess. So kind of to keep the colors nice and bright, I dry my layers. I've also cut out any footage where I'm like opening bottles or, you know, like the boring stuff, and also the times where I am just kind of sitting back and looking at my work and thinking like, what do I want to do next? So you don't have to sit through that, but I'm mentioning it because I think it's really important for you to know that, like, you know, it looks like a really seamless, quick process when you're watching this video, but the actual footage was more like, you know, it was over an hour long. I sat and worked on this page for maybe an hour and a half to get it to where it ends up in the end. So I am thinking about contrast right now. I am applying white paint. So the bottom of the page is kind of darker with the dark blue, and then a bit kind of mid-tones with the pink, and then at the top I'm now adding white, so that you've got kind of like an interesting contrast happening throughout the page, rather than it all being the same. Here I am using India ink with a thin brush to add some texture and lines to the background. The technique is going around the edges where the edges are a bit darker, and that's a technique that I enjoy. This is a simple red colored pencil, and I'm scribbling, just doing some journaling that is illegible on the page. And this is a technique that I will come back to again and again. It's kind of like it allows me to write out some thoughts, have that kind of extra texture in the page, but without really doing anything that is super clear, as in like these are words I'm adding. So here I have moved on to sketching out a face. I say sketching, but I'm actually using the India ink and a very small round brush, and I'm just freehanding this. I kind of like, I really like that imperfect way of working, the kind of scribbly lines where things aren't really symmetrical, things like that. And that is something that you kind of have to practice and embrace, because obviously I understand that temptation of really wanting things to be quite perfect and wanting things to be, I don't know, maybe like realistic looking, and like embracing the kind of like the weird and wonderful. That's I think some people are good at that and some people find it harder, and for me it's definitely been a journey. So here I'm kind of giving her some tentacle like arms. I think it started by trying to give her arms, and then they turned into tentacles. And again, that was just a decision in the moment. And you can see I'm going over that post-it note, kind of deciding that I didn't necessarily want it to be a focal point, but you still end up seeing it in the final spread, so it kind of like gets more integrated. So I think there's kind of different stages to working on something like this. Sometimes I am working completely intuitively, kind of like playing with colors, just having my hand moving. And then what you see me doing now is more deliberate. Like I've made a decision to do something, and then I'm kind of just working it out, and then I'll spend 5 or 10 or 15 minutes working that out. It's not super creative, it's just kind of completing a thought. And then because this is the black is India ink, it dries without, like, you don't activate it again when you go over it, so you can quite easily go over it with paint again. And here I am adding watercolors for shading the face, and I don't have to worry about the ink smudging because I've, as I said before, I've dried it with my heat tool. And then just very, very lightly adding some colors to the face, and I'm obviously adding watercolor on top of acrylics, which, I mean, I guess they say that you shouldn't do that, but I do that anyway because I enjoy the way it looks. And I use a very, very light touch with my brush, so I'm kind of almost like laying the color on top of it. It's not really soaking into the paper because obviously there's acrylic paint underneath. So just kind of dabbing the brush with the color. I'm doing some kind of subtle shading around the edges, kind of where the shadows would be on the face. I'm keeping it very loose. I am using colors that I enjoy. This is kind of like a fairly meditative process for me. I fill in the face with kind of a base color, then I go around the edges with the slightly darker colors, and then in the face, what you see me doing now is I'm starting to use colors that are not necessarily like quote unquote skin tones. So I'll use things like blues or purples or things like that in the face, in the shading areas, and again really subtle, and it might look a bit wrong at first when it's still a bit blotchy, but in the end, if you use this technique, it will look so much more like alive, and it will look so much more interesting than just using kind of like peach, browns, those kind of colors. So I'm coming in with some colored pencils now. That's a technique I quite like using. At this point in time, they might not take very well because obviously the page is quite shiny from the acrylic paint and the watercolors, but it all just adds kind of layers of interest. And here I'm coming in with a pen and just doing kind of scribbly lines, so that what I'm often trying to do in my art is that I want it to look raw. I want it to look imperfect. I want it to look kind of like scribbly and messy. And it's kind of like it's deliberately scribbly and messy, and it's a look I really enjoy. So I'm going in with stamps now, and I think you can see, like, what I'm showing you is kind of like the thought process, because it isn't like, oh, first I do this, then I do this, then I do this, oh, and now it's finished, I'm going to add some stamps. It's like at this point in time, I wasn't even really done with the face, but I had an idea in my head, and I just really wanted to execute that idea at that point in time. So that's why I was like, okay, yes, I want a stamp there. And so to me, that's really important. It's that listening to yourself, listening to the little whispers in yourself that go like, oh, I really want to do this. And then to listen to them rather than, like my rational voice might have said, oh, but I'm working on the face. I should really finish the face first. Or, I haven't done this other thing yet. And I feel like working in an intuitive way, which is specifically what I try to do, where I really try to use my art journal and my art to kind of just express myself and to allow, as far as I'm able to really allow everything to come out. It's really important to kind of listen to those little whispers of, oh, what if I do this? Or, oh, I really want to do this, or I really want to use this color, that kind of thing. And to not really deny or rationalize what your decisions are, because that really gets in the way of the intuitive process. And I think this can be a little bit difficult, because I think we often come from a place where when you sit down to make art, you sit down to make something specific, either for a purpose or because you want to achieve a certain result. And embracing this way of making art that's a lot less about specific results, it's that's a real process. That's a real kind of like something to learn. So here I'm just kind of making the stamped words stand out a bit more, because the stamping ink didn't look very clear. And then I am moving on to the filling in of the body tentacles. I'm using some white gouache for this, which is one of those supplies that I have had for ages but never actually really used. But I have to say I really enjoyed using it here. I think it applies in a similar way as like if I might have used white acrylic ink, or if I'd have used like watered down white acrylic. It just goes on quite easily, and you can, with the little brush that I'm using, it's it's a small square brush. It's quite easy to be quite neat on the edges, so that you're not kind of painting outside the lines. Obviously I'm a very big fan of painting outside the lines, but in a way that would have to be deliberate. And in this kind of part of the process, I wanted it to be neat, and I wanted to paint inside those black lines. But as you will see a bit later, that I do accidentally go over things, and then I don't really worry about that. I come back in later to kind of just firm up all of those black lines again, just so that it's neat. I think that a page like this, an artwork like this, it kind of emerges, and you're making decisions throughout about what you want to keep and what you want to cover over, what you do that you like and what you do that you don't really like. And if you've got something that you like, I know that there's this real temptation to kind of hold on to it and then to like feel like, oh, I don't want to spoil it. Like, you know, I can't touch that bit anymore because I like it and I'm afraid to spoil it. But I've learned that you know, you can go over things again and almost like obscure them, but because you know the bit that you like, you can then bring that back. And I do that quite a lot, like where I will be working on a face and then I kind of like smudge the whole face and then I go back over it and bring all of the things back, and it lends a real kind of much more of a depth to the layering and to the look of the face, rather than having just one layer of application. It's just, yeah, that's one of the things that I like doing. Here I'm going back in with watercolors. This is Lunar Black, a Daniel Smith watercolor, which is one of my favorite watercolors to just kind of add as texture. When it dries really nice and grainy, like a kind of a grainy black, and I really enjoy that. So here I came in with some kind of it's a yellow watercolor and maybe also like a green gold, and I kind of mixed them together a little bit. I think I might have been inspired by the yellow from that post-it note, and you know, there's kind of there's an explanation, like a technical explanation, which is that I am using a color scheme that is kind of like a triad, I think it's called. Where you're using 3 equidistant colors on the color wheel. So we're talking yellow, red, and blue, which are, you know, the 3 primary colors. And, you know, those types of color schemes, they work. I think that when it was just the blue and the red, it felt a bit, I don't know, like it lacked warmth, I guess. So that's why it wasn't a conscious decision. It wasn't like, oh, it lacks warmth, I need to add yellow. But it was more like an intuitive decision. But I do think that intuitive decision is built up out of color theory knowledge that, you know, I've acquired at some point. And I think that's kind of important to kind of acknowledge as well, or to understand that the learning for intuitive art journaling is made up out of kind of different elements. So there's obviously, like as with any skill, there is the doing it part of it. You know, in order to be able to do it and get better at it, you need to just do it. But there is also your more formal learning can also come into it. And it doesn't necessarily translate directly. It's not like, you know, you're sitting down and you are learning how to do raw art journaling. It's more like, you know, I've spent some time learning about color theory, and it doesn't really have anything to do with raw art journaling. But then whenever I am working, I am drawing on that knowledge, but I hardly even realize that I'm drawing on the knowledge. And it's kind of, I think that's it's one of those things about learning, I guess, where, you know, you learn things and then you actually kind of forget that you've learned them because they become so natural. I am now applying some clear gesso, which I used to avoid like the plague. I really, really didn't enjoy that clear gesso, but now it's my favorite art supply of the moment. So I add a very thin layer, and I am being quite careful to apply it really kind of like with a feather light touch with that brush. You can see that it's smudging. So because it's obviously wet, it will reactivate any water soluble art supply. So it reactivated the watercolors, and also it reactivated the ink slightly because I think I hadn't let it dry quite properly. So that's something to kind of be aware of. But again, it just adds texture, and you can go back in to kind of neaten things up again at a later stage if you want to. Here I've gone back to that same technique as before, just scribbling words. So it's like, it can be an artistic decision where I think, oh, you know, this part of the page is a bit empty, I'm going to scribble some words. But it's also usually that I really just have thoughts that I want to put in there. And here I'm using an applicator bottle that has some white kind of fluid acrylic in it with some airbrush medium to make it flow. And I'm just scribbling words. I don't even remember what I wrote, and it's not really important. What's important is to have kind of expressed it in that moment when I wanted to write those things down. It's kind of like journaling, like writing a diary a little bit. With that clear gesso now dry, it creates a really nice surface to add colored pencils to. And that's what I'm doing here. So it's I might be using similar colors as what I used previously with the paint, but because of the clear gesso and then with the colored pencil, you get a very different texture, and that is again one of those textures that really can add to the layered feel of things, kind of like having small scribbly lines that just make things look more raw and less pristine, and just that if you were looking at the page kind of as an overview, you're like, oh yeah, that looks really interesting, and then if you look with more attention to detail, then you see how complex it is. And that's something that I really like, the kind of the layers of complexity, and that is something that you kind of keep adding. Here I'm using that applicator also again to add in some highlights. Highlights are really important in order to make kind of things stand out, to make them pop. That face that I did is actually quite like, it's quite neutral. It's a bit lacking in contrast in a way. So it really needed those white highlights to kind of just make it pop more, make it stand out, rather than kind of like having it merging into the background. And now I'm doing some detailing. This is just black India ink again, and a very small round brush. The brushes I use are fairly cheap. I got these at like the WH Smith's, like the stationers. They're just, I don't have to take care of them very much, but I do, I just have some different brushes for different kind of purposes, and these kind of small round brushes work really nicely for ink. And so this is kind of like just a meditative stage. Here I'm adding some ink splatters. They're just with the brush loaded with watercolors and splashing all over. The bigger the brush you use, the bigger the splashes will be, the bigger the droplets will be. So here, as a kind of final layer, I am adding some oil pastels. Oil pastels, they resist what you put on top of them. So I would really recommend you do these kind of as a final detail layer. Just some accents, and kind of finishing things off, bordering things. And here I'm using a white one to just add some more white. I mean, not everything I do has a specific purpose, obviously. It's just kind of what I feel like doing in that moment. And there I am actually done. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this first video in this series of art journaling with me, Iris. And if you liked the video, please press the like button, leave me a comment, and subscribe to my channel, as it really helps me. Thank you very much, and I will hopefully see you in the next one.